Okay, so today we're going to dive into some pretty intense stuff. It's the future of NATO.
Oh, yeah.
And specifically, we're looking at this analysis that just straight up says NATO is dead.
Wow.
And it's all based on this document we have called NATO.pdf. And it all comes down to this one meeting.
Mm.
And it's really interesting how this author says this one Oval Office meeting is like the symbolic turning point for NATO.
Yeah, it's fascinating how they pinpoint that one meeting, the one where President Zelensky from Ukraine with President Trump and Vice President Vance.
Right.
The author really focuses on that tension in the room and how President Trump's whole moral equivalency thing, basically saying that Russia and Ukraine were the same.
Right.
It really shook things up.
Yeah, so it wasn't just like they disagreed, on policy or something.
Right.
It was like a crack in the foundation of, the U.S.'s commitment to defending anyone, even their allies in NATO.
Yeah, exactly. And that takes us right to the heart of NATO Article V. That whole idea of an attack on one is an attack on everyone has to jump in and help.
All for one and one for all.
Exactly. But the author is saying that that might be more like a nice idea than an actual reality. Like it works on paper, but not in the real world,
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Like that sounds great as a slogan,
Hmm.
but when it comes to actually doing it, things get a lot more complicated.
For sure.
So what's the author's take on why Article V might not actually work the way it's supposed to?
Well, they have two main problems with it.
Okay.
The first one is that Article V says something about taking necessary action.
Right.
But what does that actually mean?
Right. It's pretty vague.
Yeah, super vague. And the author uses Trump as a perfect example, because he was always talking about avoiding World War III at all costs.
Right.
So each country could just decide what level of action they think is necessary.
Mm.
And that's where things could completely fall apart.
Yeah, that ambiguity could really paralyze things. Imagine, one country sees an attack as no big deal, and another one sees it as like the start of World War III.
Yeah.
It'd be almost impossible to get everyone to agree on what to do.
Exactly. And that leads into the author's second point, which is about needing total consensus in NATO. Every single member has to agree before anything happens.
Right.
And trying to get 30 different countries to agree on something, especially something that could lead to a war, that's asking a lot.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if that kind of bureaucracy would make NATO too slow to react, if something happened quickly.
Right.
Especially you're dealing with someone like Putin who might be looking to exploit that kind of hesitation.
Oh, totally. And that all builds up to the author's main point, their boldest claim that NATO is basically dead.
It's a pretty scary thought.
It is.
But what makes them so sure about that?
Well, they argue that if Russia decided to attack the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the U.S. wouldn't step in to help them, at least not with the kind of leadership they saw in that meeting with President Trump.
Okay.
They say the U.S. would be too worried about starting a bigger war, especially because of the nuclear risk.
Yeah.
And the author thinks that that hesitation from the U.S. would actually make Putin more likely to take risks, because he'd see that weakness.
So Putin might see NATO as a paper tiger, basically.
Yeah, exactly. All bark and no bite.
But what about the other NATO members?
Right.
They wouldn't just stand by and watch, would they?
Well, the author thinks that some countries like Germany might care more about their own economy, than about helping out other countries.
Oh, wow.
They think that Poland would probably fight, and maybe France too, but neither of them would want to risk a nuclear war, especially if Putin started threatening them with those smaller tactical nukes.
So the author's saying that it's not just about whether the U.S. is committed to NATO. It's about whether anyone is willing to stand up to a nuclear power.
Exactly. And then there are some key figures like Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth.
Right.
The author puts them in a really tough position. Do they evacuate all the Americans from the Baltics now to keep them safe?
Right.
Or do they wait and risk things getting a lot worse if Russia actually does invade?
Yeah, it's like a lose-lose situation.
It really is. And the author seems especially critical of Rubio for sticking with Trump's agenda. They say it undermines all his past talk about international security,
Right.
It's like he's putting loyalty to Trump above global stability.
That's a tough accusation.
It is. It really makes you think about the motivations of these people in power.
Yeah, so we've gone from this one meeting in the Oval Office to the potential collapse of NATO.
Yeah, it's a lot.
It's a lot to process.
Yeah.
Let's take a breath here and think about what this all means for the world.
Good idea.
We'll be right back.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got this pretty bleak scenario, where NATO might not actually be the security blanket everyone thought it was.
Right.
But, What would that actually look like in the real world? What would happen if NATO was weak?
Well, think about the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania.
Right.
They used to be part of the Soviet Union, so they've got this history with Russia that makes them really vulnerable.
Yeah, and if Putin's really serious about getting those old Soviet territories back, like the author says,
Yeah.
those countries would be right in his crosshairs.
Exactly. And without NATO to back them up, they might have to try to appease Putin,
Right?
make concessions just to avoid a fight. They know they can't win.
It's almost like a domino effect, right? One country falls, and then Putin feels like he can push even further,
Correct.
and then other countries are at risk,
Yeah.
and suddenly you've got this huge conflict.
That's exactly what the author's worried about. They're saying that a weak NATO doesn't just affect Europe.
Right.
It sends a message to all the other authoritarian leaders around the world that the West is divided and hesitant to act.
So it's not just about military strength.
Mm-hmm.
It's about looking strong and unified.
Yeah, if the U.S. isn't seen as reliable, then the whole idea of collective defense falls apart.
Right. And that's why authors so hard on people like Rubio.
Yeah.
They're saying that he's basically putting his own political career ahead of global security.
It makes you wonder about what's really motivating these people in power,
It does. Are they actually committed to keeping the world stable, or are they just worried about staying in power?
Yeah, it's a tough question, but it's important to remember that this is just one perspective,
Right?
The author makes some good points, but there are other people out there who say that NATO is stronger than it looks.
Yep.
They say that it's adapted to challenges before and it can do it again.
So maybe it's not all doom and gloom.
Maybe not. Maybe there's still time for NATO to change and stay relevant,
Right. Instead of relying so much on the U.S., maybe the European countries could step up and take on more responsibility.
That's one way to do it.
And maybe that would convince the U.S. to stay involved, too.
It's possible, but even if NATO does adapt, the author brings up some really fundamental questions that we can't just ignore,
Yeah.
They're making us think about the assumptions we have about international security.
So this isn't just about NATO.
Right.
It's about understanding how power works in the world.
Uh-huh.
And whether the old ways of doing things are still going to work in a world that's constantly changing.
Exactly. International relations aren't static. Things are always changing, Alliances shift, power dynamics evolve, new threats pop up. We need to be constantly reevaluating what we think and talking about how to keep the world safe.
And that's where you, our listener, come in. What did you think about all this? Did any of the author's arguments stand out to you?
Yeah, where do you agree or disagree?
Do you think NATO's doomed, like the author does, or do you see a way for it to survive and even thrive?
It's worth thinking about because this is about the very foundation of international order and the future of global security,
We've given you one perspective on the future of NATO,
Yep.
but it's complicated.
Oh, yeah, very complicated.
There are a lot of different sides to this story. It's important to look at it from every angle, to think about the historical context and all the different factors that are at play.
The world of international relations is rarely black and white. It's all about competing interests, shifting alliances, and changing threats. This deep dive is just a glimpse into how complex all this is, but there's always more to explore.
Exactly. And as you keep exploring this topic, think about how things like new technologies are changing the game.
Yeah.
What about economic interdependence and the role of non-state actors? Those are all forces that are shaping the future of international alliances, and they deserve our attention. Okay, so we've been through a lot in this deep dive, huh?
We have.
Exploring some pretty heavy ideas about what might happen to NATO, But it's important to remember that this is just one person's take on a really complicated issue.
Right.
It's up to all of us to decide what we think about it.
Yeah, that's what's so great about these deep dives, Yep. It's not about giving you the answers. It's about making you curious and getting you to dig deeper into these topics yourself.
Exactly. We've given you some things to think about, some arguments to chew on, but this conversation doesn't end here.
Uh-huh.
What other things do you think might be affecting the future of international alliances?
Yeah, good question.
What about new technologies?
Right.
Economic ties between countries
Mm-hmm.
and these groups that aren't even part of any government,
Yeah, the non-state actors.
Right.
Yeah.
They all play a role in this.
We've talked a lot about military power,
Right.
What about the power of information, cyber warfare, even economic sanctions?
Right.
Those are all tools that can be used to influence what happens in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And they might be even more powerful than tanks and missiles in this day and age.
It's a whole new kind of battlefield.
It is.
And it's changing all the time. That's why it's so important to stay informed, to have these conversations, and to question the things we think we know
Mm-hmm.
about how the world works.
Yeah.
The future of global security is a story that's still being written, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and we all have a part to play in shaping how it ends. So keep asking questions, keep looking at things from different angles, and keep fighting for a world where peace and stability aren't just dreams but realities.
Well said.
This deep dive might be over, but the conversation goes on. Thanks for joining us and keep diving.